Welcome everyone to this meeting, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the crisis of political perspective of the Gaza protests. The IYSSE is the youth and student movement of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement, which is supported in New Zealand by the Socialist Equality Group. My name is Morgan. I'm a member of the IYSSE in Australia, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. 6 months have now passed since the beginning of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. In just half a year, Israel has displaced 1.9 million of Gaza's 2.2 million people, denied the entire population access to food, water, and medical care, and carried out daily massacres leading to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The official death toll stands at nearly 34,000 people. Once the missing are added, the true toll is likely over 44,000. Further, 76,000 have been wounded. 2/3 of those killed are women and children. Israel's promised invasion of the city of Rafah would see mass killing on an even greater scale than witnessed thus far. After 6 months of a relentless blockade, the Palestinians in Gaza face mass hunger. Israeli forces are carrying out a deliberate policy to starve the population, including by targeted killings of aid workers and people gathering at food distribution centres. It's estimated that deaths by famine will soon eclipse the number of those killed by bombs. Israeli officials have made very clear statements of genocidal intent, barely attempting to hide their murderous plans. Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant infamously declared, quote, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel," end quote. Additionally, Israel's President Isaac Herzog said, quote, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. We will fight until we break their backbone," end quote. The fascistic government of Benjamin Netanyahu has used the October 7th attack as a pretext to put into effect long-held plans for genocidal war against Gaza. But it wouldn't be able to carry out these plans for a single day without the unstinting support of the United States and its allies in Europe and Australia. These imperialist powers are arming, funding, and politically justifying one of the greatest crimes of the 21st century. Since October 7th, the US has provided over 100 arms shipments to Israel. When Israel massacred over 400 people at Al-Shifa Hospital last month, the Biden administration responded by sending another batch of 2,000-pound bombs to the IDF. More recently, the same day that Israel launched airstrikes on humanitarian aid workers from the World Central Kitchen, the US approved the transfer of thousands more bombs. The Australian and New Zealand governments have insisted on Israel's right to commit genocide, labelling it the so-called right to self-defense. But this is a conscious fraud. The Gaza genocide marks a major milestone in the criminalisation of imperialist foreign policy, in which systematic mass murder, starvation, genocide are being normalised as legitimate and routinely used methods. It's part of an eruption of US militarism throughout the Middle East, above all aimed at Iran, as part of a broader struggle for global domination, targeting what the US views as its major rivals, Russia and China. What's being rolled out now against the Palestinians will be done against workers and young people everywhere as imperialism accelerates its drive towards a nuclear Third World War. Slaughter in Gaza is having a vast social and political consequence. Already it has sparked the largest global mass protests since the Iraq War. It has shown the imperialist powers, who endlessly invoke human rights to justify their wars, as enablers and accomplices of genocide. So to take up a fight against imperialist barbarism, the danger of world war, and for the right to a future, students and young people must take up a fight against the source of war, the capitalist system. The task today is how to turn the growing mass opposition, as witnessed by the continuing demonstrations worldwide, into a conscious movement based on a socialist perspective oriented towards mobilizing the working class internationally. And this is the perspective that we'll be discussing today. So with that, I'd like to present the speaker of today's report, Tom Peters. Tom is a leading member of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and is a regular writer for the World Socialist website. So Tom, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Morgan. And I'd also like to welcome everyone attending. Today we are discussing the most important question of our time, how to stop Israel's genocide in Gaza and the accelerating global war that's been launched by the United States and its allies. For more than 6 months, millions of people have protested throughout the world, demanding an end to the mass murder of the people of Gaza. But the imperialist powers, led by the United States, have ignored these demands and continue to arm the Zionist regime to the teeth and to facilitate all of its crimes. So what this meeting has been called to discuss is what is the way forward. Two opposed perspectives are being advanced at the protests throughout the world. On the one hand, the groups that are largely organizing these events say that the large demonstrations and moral appeals directed to the same governments who are supporting the genocide can persuade them to change their minds and call for a ceasefire. This is the line that's being advanced by numerous middle-class pseudo-left organizations, including the Democratic Socialists of America, the various groups in Britain that support Jeremy Corbyn, Socialist Alliance, Solidarity and Socialist Alternative in Australia, and in New Zealand, the International Socialist Organisation, which supports Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori and is active on universities in different parts of the country. The other perspective that is being advanced by the IYSSE is to explain that the genocide in Gaza has shown the world the real face of capitalism and imperialism, and it can only be ended by ending the profit system which leads to war. What is the situation that we confront? Genocide has been openly embraced by the United States and its allies, including Germany, the UK, France, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is a warning to the entire world. The barbaric methods that are being used in Gaza will be used against any population that is perceived as an obstacle to the interests of the imperialist powers. And yet, the protest organizers repeat again and again at every event, just write to your MP, sign petitions, keep showing up to the protests, share things on social media, and eventually the powers that be, which are responsible for the worst war crimes in the 21st century, will see the error of their ways. This perspective has already proven to be a monumental failure. Despite overwhelming opposition to the genocide among ordinary people, the biggest protests the world has ever seen, the most sustained protest movement, the ethnic cleansing campaign only intensifies. And this is because support for Israel's war crimes is not some kind of a mistaken policy which can be reversed by appealing to the humanity of capitalist politicians. The genocide is not a unique episode. It has to be understood in the context of the historic breakdown of the world capitalist system. And so to reverse its long-term economic decline, US imperialism is unleashing military violence with the aim of dominating the world's resources and markets, every part of the world. Since Israel was founded in 1948, it has acted as the attack dog for the United States and the other powers in the Middle East. And the destruction of Gaza is part of the attempt by all of these countries to bring the whole resource-rich region under their control. As soon as Israel's onslaught began, the US sent warships into the Middle East and threatened to expand the war to Iran. Israel has staged numerous attacks on Iranian forces, culminating in the attack on Iran's consulate in Syria, in order to provoke a response, which is what we have now seen in the past couple of days. But the aims of US imperialism go even further than Iran. This was summed up recently in a Wall Street Journal editorial, which said that the war in Gaza is really, there's a quote, is really a war against Iran. And it said, quote, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are all on the march and working together. And these are all the targets of American imperialism. New Zealand is involved in all of this as a minor imperialist power allied to the United States. And New Zealand troops are assisting the US with bombing the Houthis in Yemen, as part of the Five Eyes network. This country's spy agencies could well be involved in selecting targets for the bombing in Gaza and other parts of the Middle East. This is what the Pine Gap spy base in Australia is almost certainly doing. The Labour Party in New Zealand, when it was still in power, endorsed Israel's attack on Gaza, and Prime Minister Chris Hipkins joined in the smear campaign depicting protesters as anti-Semitic. This did not prevent the Palestine Solidarity Network, Aotearoa, the main umbrella group organising the protests, from inviting Labour MPs to speak at numerous protest rallies. Sometimes these MPs have been booed off the stage by those in attendance. The International Socialist Organisation, which I mentioned before, which is involved in the New Zealand protests, says that the pressure is working and capitalist politicians are now showing more, quote, solidarity with the Palestinians and more humanity. This is what they said in a recent article on the 6-month anniversary of the genocide. Quote, mass demonstrations force the political conversation towards solidarity. This cannot happen without pressure. In October 2023, mainstream politicians refused to even discuss the call for a ceasefire, even as thousands of Palestinians died from Israeli strikes. It was mass protest that established this, the call for a ceasefire, as a basic human starting point. Nobody should be fooled by any of this. The calls for a ceasefire coming from imperialist governments and imperialist parties such as Labour are nothing more than a cover for what is their ongoing collaboration with this atrocity. The national government and the opposition parties pretend to be saddened and moved by the suffering in Gaza, even as they ramp up New Zealand's integration into America's plans for global war. Labour's Defence Minister, Andrew Little, declared last August, quote, if, for example, conflict does break out in the South China Sea, we have a stake in that, and we may be called on to play a role should conflict break out. We need to be equipped for that and prepared for it. And the national-led coalition is now preparing to join the AUKUS military pact, which is arming Australia to play a frontline role in the coming war against China. Labour has criticised AUKUS recently, mildly criticised it, but it agrees that New Zealand has a stake, in Andrew Little's words, in joining a war against China and has to prepare for it. Both parties agree that the military budget has got to be doubled at the same time as public services are being starved of funds and more people are plunged into poverty. But despite all of these facts, the International Socialist Organisation and other pseudo-lefts supported Labour and its allies in last year's election as a reformist alternative to National, even after Chris Hipkins made clear that Labour supported the assault on Gaza. On the other hand, we told the working class the truth on the World Socialist website and in our public meetings, that Labour is a party of the super rich and a party of imperialist war no less than the National Party. In every country, the major obstacle to building a socialist anti-war movement is the middle class, what we call pseudo-left organisations, such as the ISO in New Zealand, which seek to chain workers and young people to the capitalist parties. In the United States, the Democratic Socialists of America is seeking to rescue Joe Biden's election campaign by promoting the illusion that the president who's become known as Genocide Joe and his party, which is up to its neck in the blood of the Palestinian people, can somehow be pressured to abandon its support for this war. The DSA's possibly most famous member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, recently described Joe Biden as, quote, a man of tremendous empathy who understood what she called the urgency of the crisis in Gaza, and she said he was pressuring Netanyahu to alleviate the suffering. Her role, like the role of Bernie Sanders and others like him, is to provide a left-wing defense of war criminals, or as Time magazine put it in an article in February, quote, Ocasio-Cortez has been a case study of how a perceived radical can be useful for a national party in the middle of a branding crisis, end quote. That's how the media sees the crisis of the Democratic Party, just a branding crisis, of course, nothing to do with its actual role in supporting genocide and imperialist war and Wall Street. In Australia, meanwhile, the pseudo-left groups Solidarity and Socialist Alliance have called for Labour MPs to play a leading role in the Gaza rallies, even while the Labour government is one of the most staunch collaborators with the Zionist regime and its genocidal war. Another way that the pseudo-left stifles the anti-war movement is by insisting that any opposition by workers must be subordinated to the trade union apparatus, the very organizations preventing industrial action by workers to stop this genocide. The IYSSE supports the call by the Palestinian trade unions made at the start of the genocide for workers to, quote, refuse to build weapons destined for Israel, and to, quote, refuse to transport weapons to Israel, and to do everything else possible to disrupt this war. But this appeal has been rejected by the union bureaucracies in country after country, which continue to ensure the uninterrupted production and supply of weapons for Israel and for the United States and the European and other imperialist powers. The ISO in New Zealand is seeking to cover up this reality. In an article on December the 6th, it hailed the Maritime Union of Australia for supposedly assisting protests against ships that are supplying Israel. But the article didn't mention the fact that this union is enforcing business as usual at all of the Australian ports, as in fact so is the Maritime Union of New Zealand, making workers continue to load and unload the very ships that hundreds of people are protesting against and trying to block. The MUA, which is fraudulently presented by the pseudo-lefts in Australia as a radical union and a supporter of Palestine, recently invited Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to address their Congress, where this supporter of genocide was applauded by the assembled union officials. Similarly, the ISO in New Zealand praises the United Auto Workers in the United States for calling for a ceasefire, without mentioning the fact that this union, one of the largest unions in America, continues to ensure the production of tanks for use by the Israeli and American military. UAW leader Shawn Fain is leading its total integration into the Biden administration's war plans, and he was recently invited to a meeting between Joe Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, where they discussed their plans for the coming war against China. As the World Socialist website stated about this remarkable meeting, the role of the union bureaucracy in the escalating global war is to discipline the working class at the home front so as to ensure the continued production and deployment of military equipment and to suppress opposition from workers, both to the war itself and to social austerity and heightened exploitation to pay for the war. It is exactly the same in New Zealand, where the union bureaucracy has played the key role in suppressing opposition to war ever since World War I. While they occasionally call for a ceasefire in Gaza, they've done precisely nothing to mobilize the working class against New Zealand's role in this war and its alliance with US imperialism. The union apparatus supports war because they are dedicated to defending capitalism. These organizations today are led by highly paid bureaucrats who function as the servants of big business and the police force for the ruling elite in the working class. They ceased to represent the interests of workers, even to a limited degree, decades ago. In the 1980s, the New Zealand unions responded to the globalization of production by collaborating fully with David Lange's Labour government in imposing mass redundancies, privatizations, and other brutal pro-corporate restructuring, which destroyed entire communities across the country. And now they are again overseeing mass redundancies and austerity throughout New Zealand. The pseudo-lefts attach themselves to the unions for the same reason that they cling to the Labour Party and the parliamentary system. Groups like the ISO, the DSA, Solidarity in Australia represent sections of the upper middle class, dedicated not to overthrowing capitalism, but to improving their own positions within the capitalist system, including through careers in the trade unions and the political establishment, the state, and academia. They provide a vital service to the ruling class by posing as socialists so that they can drum up illusions in imperialist politicians like Jacinda Ardern or Joe Biden or Anthony Albanese. In fact, the pseudo-lefts increasingly claim that the United States and NATO, the imperialist alliance, the same powers that are supporting the genocide in Gaza, are actually, at the same time, defending freedom and democracy in other parts of the world. When Vladimir Putin launched his, what was a disastrous and a reactionary invasion, a criminal invasion of Ukraine, the pseudo-lefts rushed to support the United States and the other imperialist powers which had provoked this invasion. The ISO, in an article published on March the 8th, 2022, insisted that Ukraine must have the freedom to join NATO, which would directly involve the European and American powers in a war with Russia. The ISO declared that, quote, to deny the right of Ukraine to choose its own security arrangements and foreign policy is to make concessions to Russian imperialism, end quote. What they mean by that is that anyone who opposes the expansion of the imperialist military bloc NATO is a tool of Russia, of Vladimir Putin. Now, this war, which has already killed hundreds of thousands of people, continues to intensify, and the regime in Kiev is seeking to conscript hundreds of thousands more young people to be killed and maimed at the front. Meanwhile, the ruling class in Britain, France, and Germany are openly discussing the need to bring back conscription for war against Russia, a topic that we have covered extensively on the World Socialist website. The aim of the pseudo-lefts is to obscure the strategy of US and European imperialism, which underlies both the war and the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. And that strategy is to redivide the world and to seize control of resources at the expense of Russia, China, and their allies. The evolution of groups like the DSA and the ISO into right-wing pro-imperialist organizations stems from their whole history. All of these organizations can trace their origins back to splits from the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist movement, during the 20th century, when they adapted either to imperialism or to counter-revolutionary Stalinism in the Soviet Union. They have nothing to do, in other words, with genuine socialism or with the working class. As I say, they represent the interests of a privileged layer which benefits materially from capitalism. And that's why they're obsessed with identity politics based on race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. What they want is a more equitable distribution of wealth within the richest 10% of society, while keeping workers and the oppressed masses divided to prevent a unified movement against the capitalist system. The real alternative to imperialist barbarism is the program and perspective which we fight for, the World Trotskyist Movement and the IYSSE, its youth organization. We insist that militarism and war don't just emerge out of the minds of political leaders. War is a product of the objective contradictions of capitalism, the inevitable product of those contradictions between the world economy and its division into competing rival nation states, and the contradiction between the private ownership of the means of production and their increasingly socialized character, operated by billions of working people around the world. For that reason, ending the genocide and the broader spiral towards a catastrophic nuclear war requires ending capitalism. The social force which is capable of achieving this immense historic task is the working class, the vast majority of the world's population. Workers produce all of the wealth in society, but the lion's share of that wealth is hoarded by the capitalist elite. The IYSSE fights to turn students and youth to the working class, not to appeal to pro-imperialist governments and parties and their supporters in the trade unions. We fully support all of the protests against the genocide and the fact that tens of millions of people continue to take part week after week points to a significant radicalization among ordinary people, especially the younger generations. But we also insist that anger and disgust with the status quo is not enough. The anti-war movement needs a perspective that is based on political realities and not on illusions and lies. Because without a correct political perspective, protests by themselves can end in demoralization, despair, or a belief that nothing will ever change. The movement against the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was the largest global protests ever seen up to that point, is an example that must be learned from. It had no socialist perspective. The protests remained politically subordinated to the Democratic Party in the US, to the Labour Party in this country, and similar parties all throughout the world. And so they failed to stop the war. And the protest movement basically disappeared for many, many years as a result of its political subordination to pro-war parties. What we are seeking to do is to imbue young people with an optimism that war and all of the disasters produced by capitalism can be ended. In December 2022, the IYSSE held a global online rally titled "For a Mass Movement of Youth and Students to Stop the War in Ukraine." Speakers from our movement from across the world elaborated the socialist perspective needed to fight against war, which has only become more urgent with the emergence of the mass anti-war protests. We drew upon the analysis of the International Committee of the Fourth International made in its 2016 resolution, Socialism and the Fight Against War, which states that the struggle against war must be based on the working class. The movement has to turn out to the factories and to the other workplaces and call on workers to stop the production and to stop the shipping of military equipment, and for a political general strike against war. The anti-war movement must also be socialist and anti-capitalist. It has to link the fight against war with the fight against inequality, the fight against the brutal austerity measures that are being inflicted on working people in every country. These things are connected, of course, because cuts are made to healthcare and other vital programs in order to pay for war. And we said it must be a global movement, opposed to every form of nationalism, that's used to divide workers and to pit them against each other. And for all of these reasons, the anti-war movement has to be independent, completely independent, and hostile to all the capitalist political parties and the unions which defend capitalism as well. That is the perspective which was fought for by the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, in the Russian Revolution of October 1917. To this day, this remains the only social revolution which put in power a workers' government. It was the most progressive event in world history, and the overthrow of capitalism by the Russian workers precipitated the end of the First World War. The revolution succeeded because Lenin and the Bolsheviks exposed before the eyes of the working class the treachery of all of those tendencies in Russia and internationally, which pretended that the war could be ended through pacifist appeals to the imperialist governments and without the overthrow of capitalism. The same thing is needed today, namely a political party that fights for the independent interests of the world working class. In 1917, that was the Bolshevik Party, and in 2024, it's the International Committee of the Fourth International and its youth movement, the IYSSE. Capitalism is an obsolete system. It promises a future of climate catastrophe, mass illness from never-ending pandemics, genocide, nuclear war, poverty, and authoritarianism and dictatorship. But the crisis of capitalism that produces war also creates the objective conditions for socialist revolution. And what is urgently required is new organizations and political leadership to lead this revolutionary movement, which will emerge. And I therefore urge everyone taking part today to join the fight to build the World Party of Socialist Revolution and to establish a section of this party in New Zealand and to join the Socialist Equality and National Youth and Students for Social Equality. So thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thanks, Tom. It's a very comprehensive report. Definitely a lot of issues that can be discussed. So we would like to open up the meeting now to you and hear any questions or comments you might have. Please leave them in the chat. But I see we do have one comment from Derek. Every time a US spokesperson talks about de-escalating the Israel-Iran crisis, I'm reminded of the routine they've run in the Ukraine war. They kept saying that some new weapon could not be shipped to Ukraine because it risked a dangerous escalation, and then send that weapon a few months later.
Well, I mean, Derek's completely correct about that, and the whole strategy is to escalate both of these wars, and that's something that we have drawn out on the World Socialist website in our coverage. All of the talk of de-escalation is, utterly, transparently lies and hypocrisy. I mean, in the case of Gaza, you can see that very clearly just in the events of the past few days. You now have spokespeople for the White House saying, Iran must pull back, Iran cannot escalate. We support Israel's right to defend itself from Iran. They endorsed the war crime which Iran responded to in its rather ineffectual attempt to strike Israel. I mean, I'm talking about the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus in Syria, where I believe 6 or 7 members of the Iranian military leadership were killed, as well as other people. And this has not been condemned by the United States as a clear escalation, an act of war, in fact, by the Netanyahu regime, which is seeking war with Iran. Um, it was supported. It's supported by the United States and I would add by the other imperialist powers. I just saw an interview um, from yesterday with David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, where he was asked, isn't this an escalation? Why have you not condemned the strike on this embassy? What would you do if a British embassy was bombed somewhere in the world? And he said, well, we'd have to respond, obviously. But of course, there's a massive double standard. The imperialist powers can respond, they can bomb whoever they would like. Israel can bomb whoever it likes, kill as many people as it wants with total impunity, and it's called self-defense. And the Iran, any response from Iran, no matter even an ineffectual, minimal, tokenistic response, um, is denounced as driving a major escalation towards war. And the yeah, as Derek says in his comment, the point about Ukraine, uh, if you remember, ever since this conflict began, I believe one of Joe Biden's early speeches was to say we will not send Americans, we will not send American tanks and planes and other equipment because if we, that's World War III was his words. And then, sure enough, within a short space of time, America approved sending tanks, sending other high-powered equipment, and as well as NATO has sent trainers and other military advisors into Ukraine. Uh, and now NATO is talking very openly about what they are preparing, which is a direct war against Russia. This was the goal from the outset with Ukraine, going back all the way to 2014, when the United States and NATO sponsored a coup that got rid of the Russian-aligned president and installed a new government, an extreme right-wing government that was basically the puppets of Washington, and provoked a civil war, provoked the Russian annexation of Crimea, and this has now escalated into a confrontation between nuclear-armed powers that is very rapidly escalating and rightfully be described as the opening stages of a third world war. So anyway, thanks for your comment on that, Derek.
First of all, I would just add to that what Tom said, which I think is absolutely correct. I think the broader point for young people is to not be fooled by statements of the imperialist powers who, for whatever reason, are trying to disguise their plans or delude the population into thinking that considerations are being made. I mean, these are the powers which are driving towards world war, as Tom has outlined. These are long-held plans which are now being put into action. And if in the case with New Zealand or Australian governments, or even Biden, if there's some sort of attempt to distance themselves from the crimes being carried out in Israel, this is a complete fraud. Young people have to draw the lessons from the genocide, which is that it hasn't been carried out alone by the Zionist regime of Netanyahu. It's had these imperialist powers behind them at every step. And even as they're claiming to be concerned with de-escalating tensions, they're actually carrying out actions which are consciously aimed at ramping up the situation in the Middle East and throughout the world. I mean, if you want the real, you know, policy of the imperialist powers, I think it was sort of nakedly expressed by Republican congressman in the US quite recently, Tim Walberg, who said about Gaza, I'll just read the quote. We shouldn't be spending a dime on humanitarian aid. It should be like Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Get it over quick. Um, so, in other words, calling for the total destruction of Gaza um, in the same way that Japanese cities were bombed with nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. I mean, this is the sort of this is what we say when it marks a turning point in imperialist foreign policy. I mean, they're attempting to legitimize crimes associated with the Nazis as normal methods of war. So I think yeah, it is important that people draw lessons from this, and I think they are drawing lessons. We do have a question from Stephanie, which I think is directly related to this. It's a very important question. What can we do right now other than protests and signing petitions in regards to what is happening in Palestine? And then she says, and everything else you have mentioned for that matter.
I think that is an important question, definitely. And as I said, we absolutely support the protests that are being held throughout the world. But the question is, what is the political perspective that is being put forward at these protests? And that's what we are highly critical of and opposed to the idea that these events can somehow put an end to the war just by appealing to the conscience of Joe Biden and the European leaders and for that matter, Christopher Luxon and Anthony Albanese. I mean, it's not going to happen. And the past 6 months proves that they are totally ignoring and we've been to most of the protests that we can get to in Wellington and spoken to a lot of people there, and they widely agree that these protests are being ignored. There is a real growing sense of frustration, which we have found in our interventions in Australia as well, and America and Europe, where our parties have been covering the protests and speaking to people at them. So the question is, just to be absolutely clear, it's not about telling people don't protest. The point we're making is there's got to be a realistic, a perspective that's based on political reality. The reality that this war is not an isolated event, that it is connected with the imperialist drive to basically conquer the world at the expense of Russia and China and Iran as well. So that's first of all, and then once that is recognized, that there have to be political conclusions drawn. Workers can't it's not a matter of reversing this or that policy of this or that government. What has to happen is the overthrow of this regime, of this whole system of capitalism, which is leading the world into a third world war. And from that overarching socialist strategy, the socialist fight against war, there are tactics that logically follow from that. So instead of directing our appeals to Parliament or to government leaders, we appeal to the working class. We call on workers. We call on people who are going to these protests, young people in universities and schools, for that matter, should be going to the factories. Should be appealing to workers on the docks. Should be telling them they've got to take this fight up and organize themselves independently of the trade unions uh, in order to stop this war, to take, industrial action, to take strike action, following, in fact, what was requested, what was called for by the Palestinian trade unions, which I quoted from. There have to be strikes, there have to be other actions by workers throughout the world to shut down this war. They have the power to do it. It can be done. It has been done in the First World War. That's what took place. Workers intervened, and they, inspired by the Russian Revolution, inspired by socialist internationalism represented by Lenin and Trotsky, the working class, that is masses of ordinary people, intervened, not just with protests, but with actions to put an end to the carnage that had destroyed millions of lives across Europe. And that's why I referred to the First World War. What ended the war was socialist revolution. And if we're going to prevent a Third World War, that's what will be required. We know that what we're raising is not easy. We don't have easy answers. This is, to this crisis of capitalism. There has to be a political party built, a political leadership, in order to spread socialist consciousness and to win the working class to our perspective. So those are the tasks, and that's what we are putting forward with this meeting.
Thanks, Tom. We are getting other comments coming through. There's one from David, reads, excellent Kororo from Tom. The only thing where I have a major difference in opinion is Russia's special military operation into Ukraine. I think they were left with no choice, and presently they seem to be the only superpower able and willing to stand up to the US. From Steve, we have, humanity is very close to a nuclear exchange and at the same time, socialist revolution. Who will prevail is the question. Struggle will determine the outcome. There are no guarantees. There's another comment from Derek. The only superpower in the world that can defeat imperialism is the international working class. The Putin regime keeps talking about Western partners, even when it is apparent that they are the target of a regime change operation. If Putin will seek accommodation with NATO, when NATO is trying to kill him personally, he'll certainly bargain away anyone else's life. We'll take a contribution from Max Body, who's present at the meeting today. Max is the Assistant National Secretary of our section in Australia, the Socialist Equality Party. I think he'd like to speak on some of these issues.
Well, thanks, Morgan, and thank you for letting me speak at what I think is a really important discussion that has opened up on a very central question that is raised by Stephanie. As she words it, she says, what can we do right now other than protest and signing petitions? Well, to answer that, very directly, there is a lot more that can be done. In fact, I think that one has to begin to, and I think this has been importantly laid out by Comrade Tom, begin to draw some political conclusions over the experience of the last 6 months. There have been unending protests worldwide, in every country around the world. In Australia, there has literally been a protest every weekend, at least in Sydney and Melbourne, since the genocide began. But what has been the perspective that's presented at these protests? I think, as Tom went through very concretely, that we must appeal to Albanese and the Labor government here, that we have to appeal to the New Zealand Labor government, to intervene somehow, to appeal to the Greens, to appeal to the unions, to sign petitions. I think, these experiences have to be looked at and then say, well, what is actually required to put an end to this? It is clear that individual acts, petitions being signed or appeals to the very capitalist governments who are not just supportive, but actively involved in the slaughter. I mean, that has to be a central point and takeaway. They are actively involved in the slaughter. I'm speaking obviously sharply about the Australian Labor government, who is, it's been clear and almost unmistakably been revealed that they are sending munitions and also parts that are critical for jet fighters that are bombing the Palestinian population, as well as utilising the Pine Gap spy base in the Northern Territory to send intelligence over to Israel and the US to carry out the genocide. I mean, they are actively involved. So then I think there needs to be, and I think importantly, Tom outlined that there is a way to stop this, but it is not, as I said, through, say, personal acts, protest politics, but through a social force who actually has within itself the power to overcome not only this question of the genocide, but the question of the danger of a third world war more broadly, and in that sense, an end to the system of social inequality and social misery, and that is the working class. Now we have a contradiction, in that sense. Crisis, capitalism and its crisis have never been so acute. You have never had a situation in the same form in which genocide is being conducted, being carried out in plain sight. We're seeing it, every one of us, every day on social media, yet it is being supported to the hilt by every capitalist government the world over, including, one might add, the bourgeois Arab states who have completely facilitated this genocide. More concerned they are of the own disruption within their own country and crisis that's unfolding than they are in any sense over the question of a genocide being carried out. So very direct lessons, I think, have to be drawn, as I said, and I think Tom went through this. It is not one rule for the Palestinians and another for the working class here. The same assault, this same barbarism will be enacted in one form or another of the working class population in countries around the world. So if these political conclusions begin to be drawn, well, then what needs to happen? What action in that sense needs to happen? Well, to kind of paraphrase Comrade David North, who gave, and I encourage everybody here to read, a very strong lecture in March on the death of Aaron Bushnell, who I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, the young man who self-immolated as a protest to what was happening in Gaza. And the lecture is titled, well, what are the political lessons? And I think this was a critical lecture as it examined, firstly, that suicide is not in that sense just a question of an individual, but it itself is a product of society, a form of social murder, as the misery enacted upon the population is expressed through these desperate acts. And he also criticised, and Tom touched on these layers, the various layers who came out, and this includes those involved in these protest politics, and essentially created the conditions of martyrdom. That Bushnell is not just, in that sense, a tragedy, but is in fact a way forward, that there has to be further acts along these lines carried out by other individuals, because this will transform the situation. And this is a very dangerous perspective. The answer is not in individual acts of protests. The answer is the collective action of the movement of the working class based on a conscious assimilation of the strategic lessons of history. That is, above all, this perspective of world socialist revolution. And so one of the things that Comrade David North said, just in summation of his critical lecture, which, as I said, I think everyone here should read, he says, transform your anger and outrage into effective political action, into the determination to master Marxist theory, to turn the lessons of history, to learn the lessons of history, I should say, to acquaint yourself with the great revolutionary struggles of the last century. And as he says, there is some urgency to these tasks. What is presented before us at the moment is not simply the question of a genocide in isolation, but the potential wiping out of all of humanity through world war and nuclear holocaust, which is a possibility that, if capitalism is left unchecked. So what therefore is before Stephanie, as it is to everyone else who is here, is the necessity of taking up this struggle. And that is through this party. That is through the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, to take up a study of this history, to join the movement, to begin to work through these critical historical lessons, to join the ranks of the Revolutionary Party, to take forward this fight and action. And I think there was another question from Stephanie later on. How do we, I can't find it now, sorry, but something along the lines of, how do we start this action? We should be speaking at rallies. I mean, that's definitely a possibility, depending. I mean, certainly we have been prevented, there's no question, at speaking at different rallies, precisely because these very layers are hostile to our political position. But the question then becomes, as I said, the question that's before everyone here, of joining the party, of joining the ranks of the Revolutionary Party and undertaking a study of this critical history in order to bring it into the working class. So I just wanted to emphasise some of those points, and I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks for that, Max. That was an important contribution. We've also, another comrade who's raised his hand is John Braddock. And John is a member of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. Like Tom, he's a regular writer of the World Socialist website, writes on New Zealand and also issues relating to the South Pacific. So, John, I'll give the floor to you.
Thanks, Morgan. Yes, well, just firstly, I agree very much with the points that Max has just raised. I think fundamental to considering the way forward. What I did want to pick up on was, a couple of the comments that have been made about Russia and the situation in the Ukraine. I know it's backtracking a little, but I think an important point has come up about Russia, and I think we do need to emphasise that the Putin regime. There is absolutely nothing whatsoever progressive about the Putin regime. The comment about sort of Putin, standing up to US imperialism. Well, in fact, when Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin recently, Putin made it very clear that his perspective is to try and make some sort of deal with Washington. He's holding out for a resolution that will be based on on some sort of deal that he can strike with the US, which in fact the US is not interested in at all, and nor is NATO. But who is Putin? What is the regime that he represents? Well, it's the benefactor of the destruction of the Soviet Union in 1991. The reintroduction of the most brutal form of capitalism in that country. He's the representative of a layer of wealthy oligarchs who have imposed absolutely brutal conditions on the Russian working class, and in a reactionary response to the push of NATO towards the Russian border, instituted an invasion, which we don't support, but the position we have taken right from the start as the instigator of the situation was the US and NATO, which was encroaching ever closer onto the Russian borders since the Maidan regime change operation in 2014. But we shouldn't have any illusions that the Putin regime or Russia is, standing up to imperialism. So the question is, who should deal with that situation? Well, our perspective is that the Russian and Ukrainian working classes need to unite with workers in Europe to put an end to both of these outfits. I mean, the Ukrainian regime is infested with fascists. That regime needs to be overthrown, and it's a perspective that the working classes in both of these countries, need to unite, and increasingly need to unite across Europe against the preparations that are now being made and very far advanced by the powers in NATO to advance the war. So it's the working classes that need to deal with these capitalist powers, and I think we shouldn't place any illusions whatsoever. That Russia represents some sort of progressive force that can fight off imperialism. I mean, it just is impossible. Just one other point I would like to make in relation to the Ukraine question is that there is, of course, in New Zealand a perspective, and this is promoted in particular by Professor Robert Patman at Otago University, who's has a very strong sort of presence on the media. That his position is basically that the war against Putin is absolutely justified, but somehow on Ukraine, on Gaza, the US is making a sort of a mistake. His position on the Gaza conflict is that the US is misguided, it's mistaken, it's sort of a problem that he's dealing with, and I think the conception that we have to sort of carry forward is that both of these, the situation in Gaza and the situation in the Ukraine, are part of a common a common agenda by the US to dominate the world. That it's a perspective of war in international war. That there's not a correct a correct perspective on Ukraine and a mistake happening in Gaza. These are two sides of the same coin. And I think the essential question that has arisen and that is central to the discussion is that the US is trying to deal with its declining economic power with the overwhelming use of military force, and so there's immense dangers in this, and the protest movement has to be built on an anti-imperialist basis, which requires the mobilisation of the working class. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I think there's an important discussion there. There are a number of questions coming through, but we can deal with as many as possible. There were some from Stephanie. How do we get involved with this call to action to spread the message among the working class? We need public speakers from the SEG speaking at the protests too. How do we start a call to action, so to speak? How do we get people to go speak to the working class and unions? And then she also asked, what is the SEG's stance on Te Tiriti or Waitangi and what's happening regarding it in New Zealand? Quite a bit there, but I don't know, Tom, you want to address those issues?
Yes, certainly, and I think some points have already been made on the first question, which I just echo. I mean, join our movement, have more discussion with us. I'm sure we will do that, and we need to begin to build this movement in New Zealand, and there's practical initiatives that we can take to do that, but we have to, we've got to. I mean, the key question is political clarification, and I think that point has been made by John and other speakers. There has to be an understanding of who are the friends of the working class, the real opponents of war, and who are the enemies, the fake, the fake posturers, the proponents of the defenders of the capitalist system, that's what we've been seeking to clarify in this meeting. I will just say a few things about the Treaty of Waitangi, which I mean it's not unrelated, and I wrote a lengthy article about the Treaty of Waitangi last year, which perhaps can be posted in the chat. But essentially, we oppose it. I mean, we oppose this was a document signed by British imperialism, the representatives of the Crown, with a number of tribal leaders in 1840 as a means to facilitate the colonization of New Zealand, to trick the Maori leadership at the time by saying that their land rights would be protected and their property would not be taken, all of which was a complete lie. It was no different in a sense to hundreds of other treaties that have been signed by the British Empire in India, in Africa, North America, with the indigenous population there. Treaties were were signed all over the place during the 19th century and then broken. And it was no different with the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand. So the treaty was a fraud. We are. I mean, what's happened is that in the 1970s and 1980s, there was an upsurge of the working class in New Zealand. There was there was a recession. There were attacks on the working class taking place, and the New Zealand ruling class turned, like the Americans before them, to the politics of identity and race in order to divide up the working class and to encourage and to co-opt essentially a layer of the upper middle class Maori by providing them with business opportunities, by transforming the tribes, the iwi, into big businesses. And that's the purpose served by the Waitangi Tribunal, and which was established in the 1970s and began making recommendations for multi-million-dollar payouts during the 1980s. This has essentially brought a layer of a very small number of Maori into the capitalist elite in order to assist the capitalist class with suppressing Maori workers and the working class as a whole. So the Treaty of Waitangi has been resurrected for this purpose. It's claimed that all of this money that's been given to the tribes is benefiting the average Maori worker. Well, that's a complete lie. It's not at all. It's the situation for Maori working people in New Zealand is horrific in terms of lower life expectancy and poor access to healthcare, higher unemployment, lower discrimination in the justice system in particular, and racism, which still certainly exists. And so we, having said all of that, it's very clear that the current government, National Act and New Zealand First in particular, are seeking to stoke racism against Maori in order to foment divisions. But this is happening on both sides of the official political spectrum. The identity politics of the Labour Party and its supporters, the Greens and Te Pāti Maori, it also stokes divisions based on race. The insistence that race is the primary division in society and not class, and that you need to have special programs, a separate healthcare authority for Maori, and which we completely disagree with. The the task of socialists is to unite the working class based on their shared class interests, and for that reason we're completely opposed to both the sort of overt racism of New Zealand First and the ACT Party, as well as the identity politics put forward by Labour and its allies. And I would just add that this is related to the topic that we are discussing of building an anti-war movement in the working class. This requires the unification of workers of all races and backgrounds, including immigrants who make up a very large proportion of the New Zealand population and are the victims of all sorts of discrimination and xenophobia and so on. The workers of this country have got to be united based on their common interests in opposing imperialist war. What the Waitangi Treaty and the Waitangi celebrations that take place every year have become is a celebration of militarism, of New Zealand imperialism. These are military ceremonies that take place at Waitangi, involving the Navy and the generals. And there's one thing that the Ardern government did was to build a dedicated museum at the Waitangi Treaty grounds to praise the Maori battalion in World War II in particular. And this was presented at the time by Andrew Little and the defense minister and other ministers as, Maori serving in World War II. That was the price of their citizenship. It's endlessly glorified in the media, and this is what they're seeking to do today, to drag young Maori who are being made unemployed by the social crisis into the military. And I would just add the boot camps that have been announced by Luxon for young offenders, which we know are, largely going to be targeted at Maori. This is also another means of promoting the military. I mean, during the election campaign, Luxon repeatedly went on about the military being our greatest leaders and mentors, and they're going to turn these young kids' lives around. So the Treaty of Waitangi is part of New Zealand's nationalist ideology, which is used to promote militarism, to divide the working class, and to as I say, to bring a small number of Maori into the capitalist class and upper middle class professions in order to defend this system that impoverishes the vast majority. So I hope that answers the question in general, but I would recommend reading my article, which has been posted in the chat, which explains our position on the treaty, which is opposed to every other political party, I should say, in one way or another. I mean, all of the parties in Parliament uphold this document, and we're opposed to all of them.
Thanks, Tom. Agree. I'd urge everyone to click on that link in the chat. It's a very important article, Lessons of the Treaty of Waitangi. Look, we are going to begin wrapping up the meeting. We have a couple more questions we'd like to get to as well. Adam says, do you think we, the public, will ever truly know how complicit our country has been in this genocide? For example, exactly how many troops have been sent to help bomb Yemen? Or whether or not Rocket Labs and Raycon have been manufacturing parts for weapon systems here on New Zealand soil for use in the Gaza genocide? There's also a question by Adam. In his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, David Suzuki put forth the idea that the climate crisis, extreme capitalism, and all the related issues we're seeing today, that every day people will become so frustrated by the lack of action from world leaders and so desperate from the decline of society that people may start taking up corporate sabotage. With this in mind, is it time to start blowing up pipelines? Did you want to have a go with that, Tom, and then we can make some more announcements before we conclude the meeting?
Sure. I think thanks, Adam, for those questions. I think in response to the first question, we probably won't know. We won't be told. I mean, it's the SAS, as you're probably aware, New Zealand's elite forces operate in secrecy, and their movements are, almost always not really revealed. A lot of what they did in Afghanistan, which New Zealand was involved in under Labour and national governments. The special forces were sent there. I think it was announced at the beginning, but they kept going back again and again without really any information given to the public. And their crimes, and they did commit atrocities, the killing of civilians and so on, were certainly not made public until they were leaked, or at least some of them were leaked years later and reported on. If you probably are aware about the revelations of made by Nikki Hager and John Stephenson in the book Hit and Run, which exposed a massacre carried out by the New Zealand forces in Afghanistan. I'm sure that's only the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more we don't know. So that all applies to the present as well. I mean, we don't, they won't tell us what the spy agencies are doing exactly. They haven't said anything specific about what these military personnel are doing, who have been sent to assist with coordinating the airstrikes in Yemen. We are, I mean, I think actually you may recall last year, I think it was, there was a revealing comment made by Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, in an interview with a New Zealand journalist, Tova O'Brien. He said that the New Zealand SAS had been training Ukrainian forces. Now, that sort of took the New Zealand government by surprise, and they denied it, and they said that he had just made a mistake. But, that could be happening, and we would not be told about it. So I think the point you make is important. And the other question in response to that, should we start blowing up pipelines? I mean, I'm not familiar with the book by David Suzuki, but no, we don't advocate, acts of sabotage like that. We are, that would serve only to disorient the population and prevent or impede our task, which is to educate and to explain to workers the need for a political mass movement against capitalism. So we don't advocate, individual actions or the actions of small groups which are taken that the working class doesn't understand, and we advocate the mobilization of workers and the raising of consciousness in the working class. That's the essential thing. And look, as I say, we also advocate direct actions to stop the supplies going to Israel, to shut down the American war machine and the manufacturing of weapons in every country. But we don't, but that has to be a politically conscious action undertaken, by the working class, not by individuals acting alone. So I hope that's clear.
All right. Well, we will begin winding up the meeting now. I think before we do end, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. But before that, I think Max would like to speak again.
Look, thanks, Morgan. I will just make a quick point on the question that Adam raises. I think Comrade Tom has correctly answered the aspect of individual acts of terror, which we fundamentally oppose, and the Marxist movement has a long history of opposing it. But if I extrapolate a little bit more from the question, the idea is that, extreme developments, climate crisis, these type of things, this forces forward the revolution. This brings it to the fore. These are things we should be advocating for and encouraging. Well, such a conception was, in fact, pushed against the founder of our movement, Leon Trotsky, in a kind of Moscow trial frame-ups that were instigated by the Stalinist bureaucracy in the 1930s. Now, not everyone here might be familiar with that, but it occurred under conditions in which the bureaucracy had grown quite conscious of of who they were, their what they rested on, and had drawn the conclusion that it was necessary to eliminate what was considered the old Bolsheviks, that were the workers or the members of the Bolshevik Party who went through the revolution, because they posed a threat to the bureaucracy itself. And so under the conditions of these huge frame-ups against Trotsky, who at the time was in exile, in which they were labeling him a fascist, every line under the sun, he convened what was eventually called the Dewey Commission, which was to deal with the charges labelled against Trotsky. And interestingly, this commission, I believe it began on April 10th, so 87 years ago, a few days ago, was when the commission convened. And part of the kind of what was labelled against Trotsky was precisely, maybe not precise, but in essence, this position. Well, don't you want war? Don't you want to make war come more quickly? Because with that, therefore, the revolution will occur. And so aren't you pushing for war? This was under conditions in 1937 in particular, in which the kind of clouds of the Second World War were beginning to circulate. And I just want to quote what Trotsky said to this very fact, because I think it very much relates to the discussion we've been having and the tasks that are before us here. He said, Trotsky said, and this is quoting, and you can find this online on Marxist.org, war has in fact often expedited revolution, but precisely for this reason, it has often led to abortive results. War sharpens social contradictions and mass discontent, but that is insufficient for the triumph of the proletarian revolution. Without a revolutionary party rooted in the masses, the revolutionary situation leads to the most cruel defeats. The task is not to expedite war. For this, unfortunately, the imperialists of all countries are working not unsuccessfully. This could be repeated for today. The task is to utilize the time which the imperialists still leave to the working masses for the building of a revolutionary party and revolutionary trade unions. Now, in this period, we are fighting for revolutionary rank-and-file committees of the working class. And he says, finally, it is in the vital interests of the proletarian revolution that the outbreak of war be delayed as long as possible, that the maximum possible time be gained for preparation. The more firm, the more courageous, the more revolutionary the conduct of the toilers, the more the imperialists will hesitate, the more surely will it be possible to postpone war. The greater will be the chances that revolution will occur prior to war and perhaps make war itself impossible. And then he finally says this: it is precisely because the Fourth International stands for the international revolution that it is one of the factors working against war. For, I repeat, the only check to a new world war is fear among the propertied classes of revolution. And so too is that true today. And so again, I will just reiterate, the question is not advocating for the bombing of pipelines, advocating for the bringing forward of World War more rapidly. No. The necessity is the building of the Fourth International, of which the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand is a sympathising group that is fighting to build a section. And so, Adam, Stephanie, others who are here, the critical question that is before you today is the question of joining this party, which is what I very much encourage all of you who are listening to do in order to take forward this fight. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Max. I think that's an appropriate note for finishing our discussion today. And I'd like to thank everyone for your questions and comments. It's been a very important meeting. Before we conclude, I did want to point your attention to some literature, which is available from our publication, Merriam Books. These 3 pamphlets are all $5. First is the Statement of Principles of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. And I would, just on going off on what Max was saying, encourage everyone to purchase this pamphlet. It is agreement with the principles of the Socialist Equality Party and the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. That's the basis on which someone can join, and it would encourage everyone here today to seriously consider joining. Secondly, we have the New Year Statement, which we published on the World Socialist website, the working class, the fight against capitalist barbarism, and the building of the World Party of Socialist Revolution. It's a statement in 4 parts, which deals with, among other things, the genocide in Gaza, war in Ukraine, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and the perspective of class struggle, mobilizing the working class. So I think that's also a very important document. And lastly, Stop Israel's Genocide Against Gaza. This is a compilation of articles, critical articles, which we published over the last 6 months on the genocide. So I would encourage everyone to have a look at those. If you're interested in purchasing any of those titles, you can contact us through email, which is on the screen there, isse.wellington@gmail.com. And lastly, I would encourage everyone to donate to the Socialist Equality Group. Our World Party is reliant on donations of workers and young people, students. We don't receive corporate donations, nor would we. We're funded exclusively by the working class. And so we call on you to donate and help us in our work, holding meetings like this, publishing the World Socialist website. All of our activities, the Trotskyist movement, unfortunately do require money. So if you'd like to donate, you can have a look at the details there. If you have a PayPal account, you can donate using our email address, scp.wellington@gmail.com. Alternatively, you can donate directly to our bank account, which is on the screen there. I believe we've shared it in the chat as well. So look, I think that was all we had to raise today. I would thank everyone again for attending this meeting of the RYSSE. We look forward to being in touch with you. We hold regular meetings. We'll provide you with details of those and our upcoming lecture on the 28th of April. Make sure you put that in your calendars. All right, so with that, I'll conclude the meeting. Thank you again, and we'll be in touch.